I would like to call upon a respected Sir Babloo Loitongbam, Director, Human Rights Alert, Manipur, to give a few words.
Respected dignitaries in the dais, ladies and gentlemen. Today is the International Human Rights Day, and we as human rights activists, this is a very proud day for us. This is the day 74 years ago, for the first time in human history, a document is produced promising each and every human being in this world, born in and already alive in 1948, but also the people who are yet to be born, the future generation, then all of you, without an exception, are entitled to certain basic fundamental human rights. This is, by any order, a very tall promise. And of course this idea was not born in a day or two, but it has a very long history. In any culture, in any civilization, the idea that human beings are different from just woods and tables and chairs are very clear. Human beings are even different from other living beings because we all believe that they are endowed by nature by the concept of dignity. Every human being has to be treated with respect, dignity and honor. If you don't do that, then there are a lot of problems that comes up. But time and again, if you look at human history, the power that be always try to control, always try to exploit. To satisfy the greed of a few people in the position of power, very often the ordinary masses are exploited and abused. Many revolutions took place in the world which oppose this idea that everybody should be treated equal. When some 500 years ago in France, when they stormed the Bastille and did the French Revolution, 1789 to be precise, they came up with a Declaration of Rights of Man. And they said, all men are born free and equal in dignity and right. And it was a revolutionary, radical statement. But they dropped the monarchy, they built a republic, and they wanted to experiment with the idea that if we can all live together as equal citizens. High ideals, but it didn't always succeed. But these ideas continue to inspire people for many, many generations. And for the first time, Universal Declaration of Human Rights also didn't came as a gift from the God from the heavens. It was a product of sweat, tears, and toil. In fact, if we look at the history, we might have to trace at least to 1941, when the world was in the middle of the Second World War. And the Nazis of Germany has taken over the entire Europe. And at that time, Winston Churchill was literally shivering because that was the time France had already fallen, Netherlands has already fallen, and only Britain remained as an independent democratic society in the world to defend the all-powerful force of the Nazis. And Winston Churchill called it the finest hour of Britain. Britain was persuading America to come on board, but America was also not so much interested because it was so far away. They were across the Atlantic and they were not affected. But one day, after the Japanese have bombed the Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt agreed that they will also come on board in the Second World War. Winston Churchill was the happiest person. From the Great Britain, Churchill took a ship and went towards the Atlantic. And President Woodrow Wilson from America also took a ship from the Americas, and they met halfway. And it was a Sunday afternoon, the Second World War, and how Churchill was in his finest hour to defend democracy during the middle of the Second World War. And President Roosevelt from the United States have agreed for the first time to be part of the Second World War. And two of them have come out in a ship, one from the Great Britain and the other from the US, and they meet halfway, and on a Sunday morning, they signed a wartime agreement, which has become the most historic agreement of all times, which continue to shape the future of our world today. And Winston Churchill said, because it was in the middle of the war, he was so busy, he was just making 10 points on a note, and this was placed to the Americans. The American civil servant went through it, and then they agreed. And this document that was signed on a Sunday morning after they had their Sunday service on the deck of a ship came to be what is called the Atlantic Charter. And for the first time, the Atlantic Charter declared that if the Allied came to win the war, then it's not going to be just another war that they are fighting. They are fighting this war in order to free the people from freedom from want, meaning that there should be no scarcity in the world, and freedom from fear, meaning that the world should not be living in the sense of fear. And they said if they win the war, unlike the Nazis who continue to control the territory and expand, they said it's going to be war of freedom. We are going to let people free and decide their own future. The concept of right to self-determination and decolonization was part of this Atlantic Charter. And once this Atlantic Charter was signed by the world's greatest power at that point of time on the Allied, this had started what you call, in Aladdin's word, the genie has gone out of the lamp. And this idea went viral around the world. Even though at that time there was no mobile phone and internet, the very idea that if we invest on this war, then you are going to build a world which is free from fear, free from want, and every nation, big and small, will be free, was a revolutionary idea that came about. And in fact, Impal was also in the middle of a big war. I'm sure in Kangla Fort, General Slim and his team must be getting wireless communication of what is happening in the Atlantic Charter. And similarly, in the rest of India, the 1942 was when the Quit India resolution came into being, and the Gandhis and the Nehrus of the world were also in the middle of the throes of the freedom struggle. So the idea that the new world is going to be a different world was a very powerful idea. And this let loose, and in fact, it gained legitimacy of the Allied force against the Axis, and that was how it was not just a war of guns and bullets, it was also a war of idea that the Second World War was fought on. And fortunately or unfortunately, the Allied were the victors, and in 1945, the Charter of the United Nations was adopted. It was drafted in Chicago, and for the first time, the idea of human rights, that earlier international law was all about nations, big states versus another state. But for the first time in human history, human personality, human beings have become a subject of international law. It's not just high contracting parties as in the League of the Nations, but now the preamble of the United Nations starts with the word we, the peoples of the United Nations. And the drafting of the United Nations Charter involves a large number of civil society, not just governments. So that was how this idea was born. But the idea that all human beings should be endowed with certain rights was conceptualized in the UN Charter. But what exactly is going to be the content of this idea was not very clearly determined. So the UN Human Rights Commission was formed in 1946, and the commission was given the task to elaborate what is this rights. So again, there's a lot of debate. It took 2 years. They were trying to do a big conference, but there was not enough. 1945-46 was a time when enough aircrafts was not available. People were just coming out from the war, so they could not do a conference because the very philosophy of what should constitute human rights was being debated upon. So UNESCO have sent out a questionnaire to all the important leaders in the world, and in India also, Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru got this questionnaire to be filled up. Unfortunately, Nehru was too busy because it was in the middle of the war, 46-47, so he never returned the questionnaire. But Mahatma Gandhi, despite of his very busy schedule, he responded to this questionnaire. And it is still part of the United Nations archive on what Mahatma Gandhi had to say about the nature of the rights that every human being will be entitled to. And I don't recollect the exact word, but he said something like, real rights should come out of a genuine effort for you to do your duty. So the interconnectedness between performing your duty and enjoyment of right was what Mahatma Gandhi underlined in that questionnaire. Having said that, 1946 to 1949, there was a drafting committee which was constituted, and it was chaired by Madam Eleanor Roosevelt, who is the wife of President Roosevelt, who signed the Atlantic Charter. Unfortunately, President Roosevelt died when the UN was being constituted. So Madam Eleanor Roosevelt was given the honor to chair the session of the drafting committee of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And interestingly, from India also, there was one Hansat Mehta. She was a Congress lady, very furious fighter of freedom and rights, and she made some very fundamental contributions to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that we are celebrating. Very often, Indian historians also tend to forget this. The first key contribution that she made was, because in the French Declaration as well as the American Declaration on Rights of Man, the beginning of the word was, all men are born free and equal. Madam Hansat Mehta said, sorry, little outdated. It should be men as well as women. And the word should be human. All human are born free and equal in dignity and rights should be the word. Eleanor Roosevelt herself tried to defend, saying that, you know, madam, when we say men, it basically means both men as well as women. So Hansat Mehta was not someone who would so easily give up and said, and therefore, let us change it to human. What is your problem? So if you Google and see the beginning of the word of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the starting sentence is, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And that was the contribution of Hansat Mehta. The other very important point that she made was, both French as well as American Declaration referred to God as the source of human dignity. Again, Hansat Mehta said, nothing doing. There are even atheists. USSR was already present. China had already had their, China was still not communist then. But we have even atheists in this session. So she insisted that the word God should be replaced by nature. So if you look at the preambular paragraph that talks about the source of where this human rights is coming from, human dignity is coming from, the word God, has been replaced by nature. So this was two very fundamental contribution. I don't want to go into too much detail, but anyway, today is a day that we are celebrating it. However, the problem is, even though India have contributed substantively into the very conceptualization of the human rights, unfortunately, today as we stand, we are also one of the biggest violators of human rights. We are seeing how, as also was pointed out in the keynote speech, hate speech has become the order of the day. How the most fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of expression, freedom of association and assembly, are systematically violated. Just day before yesterday at Singzamai, some mothers were trying to do a protest for legalization of liquor. And because Imphal is permanently under 144, 144 can be imposed only for 15 days under the law. But we have been more than 20 years under the 144. So for every protest, right to freedom of assembly is a fundamental right given by Article 19 of our Constitution. Similarly, even in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it's a right that is enjoyed. But for us, we have to first get a permission from the DC to be even gather peacefully that too and make this. We all know how many of our TV commentators, including myself, have got threatened because we express certain views which are not necessarily exactly the same as some of our powerful people up there in the government thinks. And therefore, we are passing through a very difficult phase, even though in principle, our constitution also has some of the most elaborate rights. I mean, a constitution was written more or less at the same time that the Universal Declaration was written. So what Hansat Mehta was fighting in New York and in Paris also get reflected in the Constituent Assembly when our chapter 3 was being, part 3 of our constitution was being written in the form of fundamental rights, and in part 4, the directive principles of state policy. So we do have a legal framework where human rights can be enjoyed. But unfortunately, the actual practice, when the contestation between the tendency to control and the upsurge of the ordinary people to exercise their right comes in, we are in a very difficult phase at this point in history. So we do hope that the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is starting from today till 1 year, the United Nations is going to celebrate in a big way the 75th, this is the 74th birthday of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but from today onwards, tomorrow onwards, we are starting the 75th anniversary, which is a historic moment. Unfortunately, even if you look at the international world today, there is a lot of challenge to the human rights principles, and the only way to ensure that this hard-won freedom and right is achieved is for the ordinary people, the victims, to come up and speak out. And of course, the good people in power need to support those kind of voices. The more controlling type will always try to, in their effort to expand their power, will try to subdue human rights and of the ordinary people. Now, it is a big question in front of us. India also needs to reclaim its rights and its rightful place in the world. And since we have Education Minister here, I would like to very strongly urge that National Human Rights Commission have repeatedly said that human rights should be part of our curriculum. And there is a need for us, for our children to learn the proud history of how we contributed to human rights. And this has to be taught very early on to the children for them to understand that every human beings have rights. Unfortunately, the other trend that we see in our particular Northeast is ethnicization of right. My right, but not the right of the other. Kuki right, but not Naga right. Naga right, but not Kuki right. Maitai right, but not Kuki right. That is the very antithesis of the concept of human rights. When we say human rights, it means for every human being. For people you agree with, you work together. That is not human rights. That's called solidarity. You may be in solidarity with certain people. But your real test of your commitment to human rights comes when you are dealing with people that you do not necessarily agree with. So, Rousseau once said, I despise your opinion. I completely disagree to what you say, but I will defend your right to say so, even to my death. That is the real commitment of human rights. When we say human rights, it is not just with people that we agree, but even people with which we disagree. We should be able to respect their right, and that is the real test of human rights. With these few words, let me take leave, and thank you very much again for giving me this opportunity to share something.
Thank you so much, sir. Your speech was very informative. So finally,